If we're going to stand for something and act on behalf of what we believe, politics can't just be dispensed with. If you're going to do it well, okay? If you're going to do it with some energy and gusto and spirit, and I think it does have its rewards.
Welcome to Voices of Esalen. I'm Sam Stern. Today, we're honored to be joined by former Congressman David Price, a veteran of American politics, who served North Carolina's 4th Congressional District for over 3 decades. Price was a Morehead Scholar at the University of North Carolina and a graduate of Yale University, where he received a PhD in political science. In Congress, he was for many years a key member of the House Appropriations Committee and was well known for being able to work both sides of the aisle. In addition, he was an early opponent of the 2003 invasion of Iraq and an adversary of media consolidations. In recent years, he worked diligently to promote parliamentary democracy in other countries. Together, we delve into the diminishing partisanship in the United States Congress, a topic that Price has experienced firsthand, and explore the nature of conflict and its resolution within the political landscape. We also take a deep dive into the intricacies of North Carolina's electoral politics, shedding light on how Price leveraged polling data to secure his initial victories in the 1980s. We also touch upon the ongoing battle against cynicism in politics, a struggle that the congressman has confronted throughout his career. So whether you're curious about the inner workings of the House of Representatives or simply intrigued about how the landscape of politics can unlock and shape human potential, stay tuned for this thought-provoking conversation with Congressman David Price.
I grew up in a kind of apolitical environment, small town, perfectly nice small town in East Tennessee. But my parents were, inherited their republicanism. If they were anything, they weren't political. They were very civically engaged. They were both teachers, but they were not politically very engaged at all. And so I grew up not thinking too much about it. I thought about leadership as a civic role. I aspired to that. I admired what they did. But it wasn't until I went to college and encountered the civil rights movement that it first dawned on me that I better pay some attention to politics, and also that my inherited republicanism wasn't really what I believed.
Did you go to University of North Carolina?
I went to University of North Carolina my second 2 years. I went to a junior college near home called Mars Hill in Western North Carolina at first, and that was a nurturing place, and probably a good transition for a small town boy. But it was Chapel Hill that really opened my eyes. I mean, that was a big change, and the sit-ins were sweeping across the South at that point. And I became president of one of the religious groups on campus, the Baptist group. I wasn't a Baptist, but they nonetheless elected me. And the religious groups were interfaith groups. It was my first interfaith experience. But the religious groups were the ones taking the lead and picketing the theaters and the restaurants in Chapel Hill, which at that point was a segregated Southern town.
Would this have been the mid-1960s or early?
Late 50s, early 60s. I came to Carolina in the fall of 59 and graduated in 61. Then went to Yale University School. But those 2 years were really formative. And I think looking back on it, that's probably when people ask, how'd you get into Congress? How did you ever end up running for Congress? I think probably the answer really goes back to those years. Whatever else I did in life, I was not going to be inattentive to politics. Nor was I going to take cheap shots at government, because it became clear in the course of that politics was absolutely essential to achieving the change that needed to be achieved, and government was essential to making those changes real. And so those were formative years, and that led then to changes in my religious and political and social thinking, and led me to Yale Divinity School and then to graduate work eventually in political science.
Now, I'm just curious how the idea to study political science came out of Divinity School. Were those two schools of thought aligned, or did it represent kind of a break?
Well, that's a good question, because it doesn't appear to be the natural combination. But it felt natural to me, I guess, is the way I'd put it. I didn't study political science as an undergraduate. I started out to be an engineer, like everybody who grew up in the shadow of Sputnik, or most everybody. And it took me a while to figure out that wasn't where I was headed. But I went off to Divinity School, really hungry for a liberal arts education. And I wasn't going to consider, it turns out I was in a fellowship that encouraged me to consider the ministry. I pretty quickly decided that was not for me. But I also came to understand this is a good education. This is a good place to be. And so I took an array of liberal arts courses, including then getting into political philosophy, especially. I began to think, my abiding interest is probably in politics and political science. And I'd love to be in politics someday, but I also want to have a satisfying career if politics doesn't work out. And so that looked like political science. And so I began taking a few courses in Yale's political science department, I guess just to show that I could do it. And when the time came, I was admitted into the PhD program in political science. And of course, there is a lot of connection between the way one studies social ethics in divinity school and the way one studies political philosophy. There are connections, and I later brought some of those connections together in my teaching in ethics in the Duke's public policy program. But it was a stretch to get into Yale's graduate program in political science. It's a very demanding program, but it was turns out a fairly smooth transition.
Mm-hmm. And was the transition after you finished graduate school? Did you become a professor at Duke straight away, or was there sort of other stops along the way?
Well, I stayed at Yale a while. I did not expect to be asked to stay, but I was, and decided that was probably a pretty good thing to do. That I would eventually go somewhere else, but that this was a very rich environment, and we had come to like New Haven. My wife, by then I was married. We started our family. My wife got herself elected alderman in New Haven on a Reform Democratic ticket, and so we enjoyed Yale and New Haven, and left with some regrets. But when the Duke offer came, 5 years into that stint at Yale, there wasn't any question in my mind that it was a dream offer and that I should take it, because I was being asked to join Duke's political science department with my dissertation advisor at Yale as the chairman, and being asked to start what's now the Sanford School of Public Policy, which is very exciting. A bunch of young faculty members under the leadership of Joel Fleischman, who I had also gotten to know at Yale. Mm-hmm. We were asked to put together a program in public policy, and I was supposed to figure out what ethics would look like in such a program. So it was pretty exciting, and it had the advantage of returning me to an area I'd become very fond of as an undergraduate, and really where I thought if I had any future in politics, it would be in an area like this one.
What was the trajectory like for you to go from professor at Duke to someone who enters into the field of politics? What did that look like?
It looked like the tail eventually wagging the dog. I began taking assignments. I had early on been involved in my home state of Tennessee in the last stand of Albert Gore Sr. in the U.S. Senate. So I had developed some political experience and some connections along the way. But in North Carolina, I was asked to take on various political tasks, including then decisive ones were executive director of the Democratic Party in 1980, and then full-time chairman in 84, the year of the Jim Hunt, Jesse Helms epic Senate race. By that time, the tail was pretty well wagging the dog. I was taking these year-long assignments, but was very, very deeply involved in North Carolina politics. We got our head handed to us in 1984, very devastating loss, including the loss of 3 congressional seats as well as the Senate race. And so it was at that point that I thought, well, if I'm ever going to run myself, and maybe I could do about as well as some of these folks I've been trying to help, maybe I will do that. And so in 1986, sure enough, I ran for the House. And a mere 2 years later, after those devastating losses, we won my House seat and another House seat, and Terry Sanford won a Senate seat. So pretty quick turnaround. And that's how my political career got launched.
During that time, you mentioned the 1984 Senate race between Jim Hunt and Jesse Helms, and I remember that. That was one of the first elections that I was kind of cognizant of. At that time, how did North Carolina politics skew? Was it a solidly Republican state, or what were people anticipating in an election like that?
Jim Hunt was the favorite. The state had elected Republicans and Democrats statewide. But there were still a lot of traditional, regionally based Democrats around, and the national money flowed in, the national attention. Jim Hunt, as I said, was the favorite, but Jesse Helms was the master of the scorched earth TV campaign, and they really did a job on Jim Hunt. And they put a lot of money on the air, and these ads were devastating. very clever, I have to say. But still, it was a big, big disappointment. I mean, I'd come of age, politically in this North Carolina environment. I mean, come to think of North Carolina as a different sort of Southern state, and had real high hopes for the state as a progressive bellwether, certainly in the region. Turned out Jesse Helms was able to run what we thought was a very demagogic campaign with thinly veiled racial themes, and he won. So it was a major setback.
I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about what it was like for you to engage in that first congressional run in 1986. What do you remember from that?
Well, one of the things it reminded me when you said earlier, what about the transition from academic life to politics? I learned the value of a good poll and how your tactics could change overnight based on that. And it had to do with my academic background. Back then, it was not considered particularly advantageous to come out of an academic background and go into politics. These are the years of George Wallace and the pointy-headed intellectuals and all this business. And so I kept my academic credentials pretty well under wraps. But we did have enough sense to take a poll and found out a couple of things. One was that when people were asked, is teaching and doing research and writing about Congress good preparation for serving in Congress, as opposed to being a state legislature, which was what my primary opponent was? What do you think about that? And people thought teaching about Congress was very good preparation, it turned out, just as good as being a state legislator. Lesson number one. Lesson number two, what do you think of Duke University? We gave the feeling thermometer question, figuring that Duke, here in the land of, Tar Heels and Wolfpack, wouldn't rank too high. And guess what? Everybody thought a lot of Duke University, it turned out. So we went from playing down my academic background to actually shooting an ad at me at the blackboard in the classroom.
Okay.
Turned out the politics were a little different than I had thought, and to my advantage. It was an adventure, that first race. I mean, I thought, I'd been state party chairman in a high-profile race. I thought, well, I'm pretty well known. And then I just started visiting every church supper, every crossroads barbecue I could find. After a year of this, I found my name recognition, despite all this exposure as party chairman, despite all this work out in the 5-county district, my name recognition was about 10%. And just how on earth do you ever break out of that? What I ended up doing was raising enough money to put a few ads on the air. My media guy wouldn't hear me say this, but they were kind of home movie type ads. And the idea was, aren't you fed up with all the backbiting and all the conflict and all the nastiness of North Carolina politics? We need to make it better. That was basically my theme. And my name recognition tripled. With 2 weeks of a very modest ad buy, my name recognition tripled, and I was on my way to winning that primary. So I've never done anything as hard in my life as raise money in a contested primary with a Republican incumbent. That was not easy, nor was it easy to keep it all going, keep everybody's morale up. But we, of course, were elated by the primary outcome and got a fresh head of steam. So the primary election was not quite as hard, although there again, I was running against a Republican incumbent and managed to prevail. The seat had long been held by Democrats. This Republican incumbent had ousted Ike Andrews, my predecessor, 2 years before. So we always said, if you're going to get an incumbent, get them their first time out. And that's what we managed to do.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Wow. So what's life like for a first-term congressperson going up to Capitol Hill?
Well, it probably varies depending on your background and what you bring to it and what your expectations are. Despite never having had elective office, I still pretty well knew what to expect. I had been a staff member. I got hired off the street when I was in divinity school, actually, to work for an Alaska senator, and ended up going back there 5 summers and writing my dissertation out of his office. So I knew the staff scene pretty well, and I had studied Congress, and so I kind of knew what I wanted out of my staff. I wanted a lot of initiative, a lot of entrepreneurship, looking for opportunities to do things. I understood the value of good constituent service and maintaining solid district operations. So I had a leg up in some ways. Also, a Duke graduate student, I lured him away from his graduate studies, and he became my legislative director. His name is Paul Fellman. And Paul and I cooked up a a bill. We said we're gonna do a bill becomes a law, just like the textbook. And so we picked this hot new financial product at that time: home equity loans, second mortgages, which were unregulated, totally Wild West. We wrote a bill getting some ground rules in place for home equity loans. And with 1 hour to spare in that Congress, that bill passed. so I did have, looking back, it was a great experience. And kind of confirmed for me that I was suited for this, and that this is really what I wanted to do. I subsequently lost an election in '94, so I almost didn't get to continue doing it. But fortunately for me anyway, I had to come back in '96 and stayed there until now.
I want to get to '94 concerning what I perceive as the breakdown of bipartisanship. Would you be able to speak about the state of bipartisanship when you first entered Congress?
Yeah, I welcome the chance to reflect on that, because there's no question it's become more sharply partisan and more polarized. But there's also no question that what we saw with Jesse Helms and those Skirt-Starth races, all of this had its origins back then. Those were the years when, or not long after that, when Rush Limbaugh began holding forth on the radio, and there were some very extreme forces at work, not in control of either party yet, but still. Races were pretty tough sometimes, and I certainly was on the receiving end of those. I remember my third campaign, not the one I lost, but the one before that. Our third campaign, we had an experience about how much worse things were getting. We had developed a kind of playbook for dealing with negative ads, the kind of attacks that we knew were coming, and it basically consisted of calling the opponent out, saying, come on, let's focus on the issues. Let's not descend into this name calling and so on. And that worked pretty well for a couple of cycles. But then that third campaign, it didn't work. I had a self-funding opponent who was holding me responsible for the savings and loan crisis. He ran ads of me with dollar signs flashing in my eyes. And it turned out people were inclined to believe the worst. So the old tactics didn't work, and we had to, long story, but basically we figured out how to crack the code and win that election. But it was an indication that things were getting tougher, and that there was more cynical public view of politics, and so it was going to be rough sledding ahead. And then, of course, I lost an election in '94, which was tough sledding indeed. That was the Gingrich revolution, and they had convinced people that crime, even though we have always had a very low crime district here, managed to convince people that crime was a big issue that year. And of course, that would be the year that I was running against the Raleigh police chief. So I didn't manage to lose that election. But then I came back in '96. So I would say that there's been a kind of undercurrent of, or not always an undercurrent, often quite visible, kind of right-wing politics that has thrived on conflict, tried to foment conflict. I mean, that's been a feature of our politics for a long time. Gingrich was the harbinger of it. A lot that flows from Gingrich's rise to House leadership on the Republican side, and then the kind of campaign he oversaw when he became Speaker. Having said that, it is more divided now. I think the way I described coming to Congress, wanting to learn the ropes, wanting to have a legislative success, just feeling so fortunate to be there. I remember those days, those early days. I don't know that a lot of members don't necessarily come with that same perspective now. They have been recruited by the party, funded by the party. They have a D or an R on their shirt, and they are partisan warriors. Others are increasingly tied to social media, and that's on both sides of the aisle. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in our party came to Congress with 9 million media followers. 9 million. That's more than Nancy. That's 4 times more than Nancy Pelosi as Speaker ever had. Mm. And of course, it's even more prevalent on the Republican side. All that you saw that first week of this new Congress with these guys failing to elect the Speaker until, 13 votes or so, 13 ballots. Well, they were raising money. That's what those guys were doing. They were raising money on social media big time. And the obvious implication of that is they didn't have much regard for their institutional responsibilities. Mm. And I would say, just to draw a lesson from this, I do think democracy is in trouble without institutions that work well. And democracy is not just about having elections. Democracy is figuring out somehow how to get the contending forces in society together and work out policies that address the common good. And when you can't do that, living to fight another day. I mean, that's the way democracy works. It depends on institutions that have some degree of loyalty from their members, where you invest in the institution. You're not just playing to an external audience continually. And that's much more pronounced now than it was then. You saw this coming with Rush Limbaugh and cable outlets, very partisan cable outlets. Now with social media, some members basically specialize in social media as opposed to worrying about getting along with their colleagues or doing the work of the institution. And if that ever becomes the dominant trend, then I'd say democracy is in trouble.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned cable news, et cetera. You were involved in, if I'm not mistaken, involved in various legislative initiatives to kind of roll back FCC rules, prevent media consolidation.
Oh, yeah.
Would you be open to discussing some of your views on media ownership?
Well, all of that seems kind of quaint now because I feel like history has passed us by. But yes, I felt that strongly. I had an interesting experience as a young person in my hometown. Back in the 50s, there was a wave of formation of radio stations, 1,000-watt stations all over this country. I don't know quite why it was. I think the FCC opened up the airwaves and many stations were formed, including one in my hometown. And so, that was really something to be a high school senior there on the radio with a request show. I had a good time, but I developed a feel for small town media, and ironically, small town radio was one of the first to go. Mm-hmm. I mean, so many stations for some time now have actually been run by remote control with very little in the way of local input or local content. And over the years, media has consolidated across different kinds of media. Cross-media ownership has increased, and the concentration of ownership, people owning thousands of stations and hundreds of newspapers and so on. So I, along with a kind of maverick head of a major TV station here, the one with the largest audience, he's a maverick in the industry, though, and he really was a champion of local media. And so I took a lot of cues from him, but we had a good time back some years ago in trying to at least put the brakes on media consolidation. Turned out people really cared about that. I thought, well, this is kind of an esoteric issue. Nobody's going to care much, and so we organized a meeting over at the Duke Law School just to talk about this, and thought that'd be a fairly wonkish technical discussion. Well, turned out we had an overflow crowd. And people were just up in arms about this and about big media.
One thing that seems interesting to me is that I would have guessed this is coming from a Republican president, but as to my knowledge, it came from Clinton during one of his terms. He allowed great consolidation of media. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would have to reconstruct it a little bit. There was not a clear partisan difference, and you're talking here about the FCC, the regulatory agency, as well as administration policy. But yes, I'd say that there are a lot of fingerprints on this, and that it's not strictly partisan.
Mm-hmm. Back to the partisan discussion, it seemed that during your time in Congress, you were known as somebody who could work across the aisle. Part of that being your work on the House Appropriations Committee. I know that House Appropriations Committee has a tradition of bipartisanship. How did you navigate when there were disagreements or conflicts within the committee regarding budget allocation?
That's an interesting insight. It is true that Appropriations has a history as a less partisan committee, and when you ask yourself why that's so, I think there are a lot of reasons, but the main one is that the power of the purse, the power to appropriate, which not every parliament in the world has. In fact, we have an unusual degree of power in that regard in the Congress. That's an institutional function. And with it comes the duty, I think, to scrutinize every line in the budget and also to scrutinize past performance, no matter if it's your president or not, in terms of party. You have an institutional responsibility to hold the executive accountable, and then to write a very closely considered executive budget. The president originates the budget, of course, but we have very great power to reduce, increase, modify, condition aid, and to therefore influence policy. So for a long time, that was considered a major institutional function, and the two parties would come together and defend appropriations bills against, as I said, presidents of all persuasions. And like a lot of other things, that has been modified in recent years, and often appropriations has been swamped by larger partisan forces. And you may remember the appropriations bill for the last Congress, the last one I was there for, wasn't passed until December 22nd, 3 months into the fiscal year, with just enough Republican support to get it done. And I was very happy to see that, but it certainly didn't come easily. And it wasn't like there was a presumption at the start, well, this is going to sail through on a bipartisan basis. Not at all. So it has become more partisan, but it is still, all things considered, it is still one of the more cooperative places in the Congress to work. And that's one reason I liked it. Mm-hmm. The kind of vestige of that earlier way of operating is the way we write our bills. I think that's where it's most obvious, that when the president's budget come down, we have hearings, and then we write a bill, the chairman's mark, we call it. But the chairman's mark typically has a lot of input from the ranking Republican member, or vice versa when the party control is reversed. And that is one reason, and that on December 22nd, when it comes right down to it, you look back and say, well, it was a good thing that we put this together initially on a bipartisan basis, because that makes it easier to get a deal in the end. There still is a lot of that on appropriations. I had very cordial working relationship with my Republican counterpart, Mario Diaz-Balart of Florida, and I think he would say the same about me when I was the ranking minority member and he was the chairman. So yes, it's one of the more cooperative places to work. Another reason, I guess, is that you're not making absolute policy decisions. You're saying more or less is a lot better than yes or no. More dollars, fewer dollars. You can compromise more in that realm maybe than you can if you're wanting to take policy in a certain direction. Let me also say that the most bipartisan thing I ever did was in the international realm. I initiated and then chaired or co-chaired the House Democracy Partnership for the last half of my term of service. And that's a bipartisan commission that works with parliaments and emerging democracies to share best practices. And we really put a lot of stock in that work. That was and is totally bipartisan. And we thought it would work best that way. And sure enough, it has.
Yes, definitely. That House Democracy Partnership, which aims to promote effective government, strengthen democratic institution in other countries. Tell me a little bit more about that. Where and what countries have you seen this work come to fruition?
Well, since you put it that way, it's the scorecard isn't what we'd like it to be. You can imagine. Let me just back up a little bit. We started all this I started it, and actually with the Republican speaker got it formed. So that was a bipartisan act at the very start of this. But we were building on the work of the task force chaired by Martin Frost back in the 90s. When the Iron Curtain fell and the Soviet Union dissolved, and all these parliaments, all these showcase parliaments, all of a sudden had to become real parliaments. It was a great initiative. I, as a new member of Congress, I was a part of many trips to Central and Eastern Europe, trying to help them get their libraries up and running. We sent staff members to help them with their IT and various things, and then Newt Gingrich came in and shut it down. A lot of other things, and so. But I always thought it was really important work, and kept trying to bring it back, and finally did that around 2005 or so. And we still, you ask about which countries, we still figure there's a lot of unfinished business in Central and Eastern Europe. So we engaged early on places like Ukraine, Georgia, Macedonia, Kosovo, and then later added Armenia, Moldova. So a lot of unfinished business in Central and Eastern Europe. And then worldwide, some very strategically important countries like Kenya, Indonesia. We worked in Mongolia and Liberia, Timor-Leste, East Timor, Peru, Colombia, all over the world, in very diverse countries. But what holds them together, what connects them, is that they're all struggling democracies who have had some success with peaceful transition of power, but are still struggling to make democratic institutions work. And I'd say we're still struggling.
Yeah.
Especially since the last couple of years. We've always been pretty modest about our own achievements. We understand that democracy is always a work in progress, never to be considered perfected. But we have every reason, especially in this country now, to be aware of that. So we treat this as a partnership is the word. We treat this as a common venture where we're trying to make representative institutions effective.
What are some of the main challenges you've encountered in promoting parliamentary democracy in other countries?
Well, I know you have a special interest in levels of conflict and conflict resolution, and that's very high on the agenda in these countries. And you just realize what some of these people have been through. This is literally, their parliament is literally the alternative to fighting in the streets. People are serving in these institutions often at great personal risk and sacrifice. And I just have the highest respect in a small, plucky country like Moldova or a place like Mongolia. You just think about the kind of pressures they're under, the kind of their perils that they encounter, sometimes from hostile neighbors. I just have a lot of respect for what they do. So we talk about things that might seem mundane. We may talk about about the budget process, for example, or about how you set up an ethics process, or what do you do about constituent services, and how do you reach out to your constituents and help them with navigating the agencies of government. A lot of things. How do you set up a library or professional staff so that you have some degree of confidence that you can assess proposals that come from the executive? So a lot of these things we help with, but try to help with. Often, though, the question is, what about this conflict, the handling of the opposition, the people who boycott the parliament, and it's not obvious always that the thing to do is to hang around and work things out. Sometimes more extreme tactics have some history, and so I was just in a country that was where this was true. It's the only trip like this I've taken since I retired, but I went to Guyana in South America, which it kind of rang true in some ways. They had an election. One party tried to rig the election, and they're now in the minority in the parliament, but not happily so. And so it's a real challenge for them to find any basis for cooperation. You don't handle situations like that, in my opinion, just coming in and moralizing, saying, "Can't we all get along?" That doesn't get you very far. You need to legitimate people's expressions of frustration and betrayal sometimes, and it's not that you try to paper over those things, but you do try to ask, given these deep divisions and given the fact that we've got to live together and work together. In the case of the U.S., of course, having a constitutional arrangement that says you shut the place down if you don't work together. In these situations, how do you find some kind of basis for common ground, for achieving compromise, and then how do you just all agree we'll live to fight another day on some of these other issues? This debt ceiling thing that we're going through right now is very frustrating to me as watching it as a former member. It's a totally unnecessary fight, for one thing. I mean, there's plenty of things that you need to fight over and that are worth fighting over. This is a phony fight, just set up as a political gotcha game. Having said that, though, there still is a question of negotiating objectives and negotiating style, and how you and we don't know, of course, how it's going to turn out, but this one is tough, and it's often tough. You need to have an alternative to shutting down the government as a way of showing that you care about something. A lot rides on people's ability to live with conflict and to find a way through, to navigate through the processes of government despite deep conflicts.
Yes. I want to ask you about cynicism. Sometimes when I think about politics in the United States today and abroad, some cynicism comes into the picture for me because I'm just thinking about gun control, our inability to deal with guns in the United States and all these mass shootings and anti-trans bills, which have become so prevalent, so really pushed forward by a Republican agenda. I know that it would be anathema for you to become cynical. And my question, I suppose, is just how do you avoid becoming cynical as a congressman?
It's a good question. How do you? We had that question after people refused to certify the election of Joe Biden. How do you then turn around? People actually willing to deny the peaceful transfer of power after a legitimate election. How do you work with people like that after a violation that's severe? It's not an easy question to answer. I don't want to offer some kind of glib assurance that one can do that easily. You cannot. You need to just have some perspective, I guess, is the best I can counsel. We do have a saying: you compromise where you can and fight where you must. But that really doesn't solve much of anything, because the art is in knowing which is which and which calls for which.
Uh-huh.
And that's the art of politics. I do think, as with all conflict resolution, the answer is not to paper over the conflicts or minimize the conflicts or just seek out the mushy middle. No, I think we have to have a process which lets us fully air our views, express our principles. But then we also need mechanisms that let us segment problems and solve pieces of a puzzle without taking on the whole thing. That requires a kind of democratic, small d democratic culture, where you have enough confidence in the process and enough acceptance of your fellow citizens to let you not make every battle Armageddon. Mm-hmm. Take it one step at a time. I say that knowing full well that it's easier said than done.
Yes. And it's a difficult question, and I apologize if it's something that feels sort of like unanswerable. But I'm assuming that you have some sort of expertise in it, given the fact that you were able to be a congressperson for how many terms did you serve? It seemed like it could span decades.
17 out of a possible 18, I guess you would say, given the 94 laws.
Esalen Institute, where this show originates, is predicated around this notion of human potential and just the idea that we walk around in this state of untapped capabilities, but given the right environment, the right teachings and such, we could become much more. Where do you come out on all of that?
I know something about Esalen and really appreciate your work there. Appreciate the long time service of my friend Sam Farr, who represented that area of the Congress with great integrity for a long time. Wonderful, wonderful man. I think probably what I can best say in this environment is it's tempting to shy away from politics. Maybe sometimes people who have these ethical and sort of personal developmental concerns, mm-hmm. to think that politics is not a very promising arena for fulfillment or involvement even. And I'm certainly not saying everybody should dive headfirst into politics, but I do think that when we're talking about the kind of community we want to live in, where human beings can realize their potential, and where they're not stigmatized because of this or that quality, and where we all have some sense that we're working for the common good, that the moral life is a social life. It's not just a matter of self-fulfillment. It's a matter of fulfillment in community. And, all of those things, I'm sure for a lot of your listeners, are very, very real concerns. And the hurly-burly of politics may seem at best irrelevant and at worst an unwelcome distraction. And I guess I would just urge against that view. First of all, there are a lot of nice people in politics. My late wife used to say that she loved both the camaraderie and the cause. About the cause, the kind of social ideals that we fight for, but the camaraderie is important. It's there are a lot of like-minded people. It turns out, I discovered this first in the civil rights movement. People from all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of belief systems, yet they come together for a cause. And there's a lot of that in politics. And I'd say politics is the most racially inclusive endeavor I've ever been involved in. It's the most inclusive endeavor in many ways, because you have to operate that way. And so I would say it has its rewards. And I would say even when it becomes unpleasant and difficult, it is a necessity. We just don't have the luxury dispensing with politics and government. That was true in the civil rights years. It's just amazing how quickly a movement became laws that really did protect people's rights. And that didn't happen without politics, and it did not happen without government. And so I've always said that's why I'm in this business. That fundamentally is why I'm in this business. And I would think that would recommend itself to a lot of your listeners as well. There's just no denial that in a democracy, if we're going to stand for something and act on behalf of what we believe, that politics can't just be dispensed with. It's got to be something that, if you're going to do it well. Okay, if you're going to do it with some energy and gusto and spirit, and I think it does have its rewards.
Congressman David Price, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you so much for your dedicated work to this country and to its people.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to Voices of Esalen. This episode was produced in conjunction with Shira Levine. Our theme music is by Nico Holloman. Esalen Institute is a nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing human potential and promoting positive social change. Your support helps us to continue to offer transformative programs and retreats that promote personal growth and collective well-being. To learn more about Esalen and how you can support our mission, visit our website at esalen.org.